I'm Christopher Lighton, and this is Open Source, staring down the several crises in our economy and recalling the grand old joke that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. John Cassidy of the New Yorker magazine has written a sprightly catalog of capitalism's critics over the centuries who got it right, for example, about today's inequality crisis, or the climate damage, or the threat to democracy, or the alternatives to capitalism that might still work better, or even rescue it. Welcome, John Cassidy. Economics is not my first language, but your book brings big, contentious characters alive on stage around history we should all know, anxieties we can all feel, and a question by the end. After the last century of astonishing growth, how do we find ourselves with an unpopular system in polycrisis?
Well, first, Chris, I'd like to thank you for inviting me on and giving me such a splendid introduction. The term sprightly is not usually applied to history books, economics books, so I take that as a great compliment. I guess the thesis running through the book, if you look at it from current perspective and from a sort of Trumpian perspective, which we all do these days because we can't get this terrible man out of our minds, he dominates it day to day. I see the rise of economic nationalism, Trumpian populism, whatever you want to call it, as essentially the result of a sort of crisis of the pre-existing economic model, the previous form of capitalism, sort of globalized, what I call hyper-capitalism.
Dare I say neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism is another phrase. I mean, you can tag it whatever you want. But basically the idea that unrestrained globalization, unrestrained financialization, basically let the profit motive rip. I mean, it came out of the end of the Cold War. There was a sort of period of utopianism that people thought that just because sort of state socialism collapsed, that meant that free market capitalism in its most raw form triumphed, which I don't think was correct. But I think after what we got was basically 25, 30 years of sort of unrestrained, you call it neoliberalism, I'm calling it hypercapitalism. It produced a popular backlash, both in the United States and in a lot of other developed countries. And Trump, being a great sort of opportunist and showman and operator, saw his chance and came forward and seized it.
Let's take the neoliberal thing apart a little bit, because it's the main tension in the book is roughly between the Keynesians, shall we say, who believe in managed capitalism, but getting the government's hand into the goals, the management, the theory, and the laissez-faire, no, it'll run itself. We're not responsible for it. And Friedrich Hayek, Austrian economist, the road to serfdom is let the economy run itself. Keynes is deeply involved. He's a capitalist, a manager, though, from the government side, an activist in terms of the Rooseveltian engagement in the social side of the economy. Place Trump in that perspective.
Where does Trump fit into it? I see Trump resurrecting pre-free market ideas, sort of mercantile ideas. He doesn't believe in free trade, of course. He sees trade as a sort of zero-sum game in which one side wins and one side loses. That's exactly how the mercantilists in 16th, 17th century Britain and 16th, 17th century Holland saw it too, when they were fighting each other for the lucrative trade in India and east of India, in Indonesia and Malaysia, as we'd call them today. And it was very much a sort of state-run capitalist model. There were large multinational companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, but they were state-sponsored monopolies. So in order to get one of these monopolies, you had to be well in with the government and even the monarch. It was Queen Elizabeth I who gave the royal assent to the East India Company's monopoly. Right. Trump is sort of trying to personalize capitalism in some ways. If you want to get a good deal, if you're Apple and you want to be exempted from the Trump tariffs, what do? You have to go and, pay homage to the master down at the White House or Mar-a-Lago and ask for an exemption.
Yeah, that's the royalist, monarchist.
Exactly, it is the royalist, monarchist.
You need me, not that I'm going to run your business, but it seems to me his impulse is to dominate everything.
That's definitely a part of that. I mean, he keeps drawing back because, he's scared of the markets, etc. But certainly his instinct is to assert control, and you have to get a certain sort of personal exemption from him in order to get what you want and carry on your trade. I guess it's a bit like the sort of papal indulgences which you used to be able to buy from the Catholic Church. The way you buy them from Trump is by making campaign contributions or, contributing to his inauguration, etc. So we've seen a whole procession of tech barons who we all know don't really like Trump much. They never supported him in the past, but now he's in power for a second time. They think he's sort of inevitable, so they have to sort of make their peace with him.
Let me just mention highlights I want to come to out of your book. The big victory in the story is the post-war bargain around social democracy in the 40s, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And then a 30-year golden age of industrial capitalism, roughly 45 to 75 after the Second World War. The hero in my reading is John Maynard Keynes, humanist, brilliant writer who settled for managed capitalism. The mystery is how we fell into the polycrisis of today after a century of unbelievable growth. The lesson is Keynes's line that economic history is driven by ideas more than people understand, more than by the conflicts of interest in money and politics. And the puzzle, little one, but I was intrigued, is that the missing voice is that of George Orwell, who wrote before World War II that only a socialist turn in England could make a victory out of the coming war. He was deeply interested in economics. Could I distract you with a figure that in your book intrigues me a lot, and that is Henry George. He was a newspaper man, part of the reason I'm drawn to him, but he looked at the incredible post-Civil War growth in the country, marveled at it, but also said, we're not noticing something, and that is the incredible growth of poverty,
right,
and factory abuse and hardship that came with the prosperity. He had a wonderful line that the tramp comes with the locomotive.
right.
The jails and the slums also came in that period. He said, what's wrong? He said, the answer is landlords are taking too much of the profits and contributing almost nothing to the prosperity. We're going to have steep land taxes. We could almost abolish all the rest if we put a proper tax on the landlords.
I am a Keynesian. I was educated in the Keynesian economics.
We're all Keynesians, Nixon said.
Whereas Nixon said, that was the tradition I came out of in the sort of 70s and 80s in England. He was a late Victorian liberal, really. That's what he came out of, or an Edwardian liberal. And his whole project was to try and save as much of that world as he could, the sort of liberal capitalist world of the late Edwardian and late Victorian era. And he realized it had sort of failed in a massive way, so he needed to reconstruct it. Lots of his students were joining the Communist Party. He was trying to come up with an alternative to that. Going back to Henry George, in the decades after the Civil War, he was an enormous figure. I mean, he's largely a forgotten figure now. But Progress and Poverty, the book he wrote, published in 1879, was the best-selling book in the second half of the 19th century in the United States, apart from the Bible. It outsold all the famous novelists, all the famous writers. I think it outsold the Bible for quite a few years, too. He's a very fascinating figure because he is on the sort of transition between the sort of agricultural economy, a land-based economy, and an industrial-based economy. He very much viewed things from the perspective of the land. His great theory or his great contribution is, of course, the single tax on property. If we do that, it'll be the solution to everything. He saw the big class divisions in society as not capital versus labor, but landlords, i.e. property owners, versus capital and labor who have to acquire that land to do business on or to make a living.
May I throw out a notion? The Irishman in him, if there was such a thing, sees British landlords on their ground, on the Irish ground, and they're doing all the work, and the landlords somehow claim a piece. What did they do to earn it? They inherited it, and they're not working it. In that sense, it makes all sorts of sense to turn the fire on the landowners.
Yeah, I mean, George was associated with the Irish in the 1870s and 1880s.
And he caught on in Ireland before he caught on in this country.
Yeah, to some extent he did. But he wasn't actually Irish himself. His lineage is English Episcopalians, the Low Church, what we now call evangelicals. His father was a pastor in Philadelphia and ran a religious press, putting out sort of popular religious books. So he came from a very pious religious background. even though he didn't make much of that in his books, I think that sort of low church evangelicism, which has a leveling tendency in it itself. I mean, he always described himself as a Jeffersonian,
Yes.
taking on the large interests. But then when he happened on this whole land idea that the real villains are the landlords, of course, the Irish said, well, we've been saying that for centuries. The English landlords have been destroying the country since the year dot. So they immediately picked up on him and they invited him over to Ireland. He spent a year over there traveling around and writing pieces. He wrote for the Irish newspaper in New York. He was sponsored by the Irish-dominated labor unions in New York City and actually ran for mayor in 1886. So
that was amazing news to me. And he placed ahead of a young fellow named Theodore Roosevelt, who was also running for mayor.
Right. Teddy Roosevelt was a young Republican at the time. And George got about 70,000 votes. Teddy Roosevelt got about 60,000, so he beat Roosevelt. But he lost to the Tammany Hall candidate, who was a member of the Hewitt family. I'd always thought that the Tammany Hall didn't have anything to do with the great old sort of New York aristocracy. But in this case, I guess there was an alliance of convenience to keep down the labor unions and keep down Henry George. So this chap called Abram Hewitt was the Tammany Hall candidate, and he won. Henry George, again, bringing us back to date, he always thought he was cheated. He may well have been. It's Tammany Hall we're dealing with here. They had all the award healers and the vote counters, etc. So he always said, in a fair election, I would have won. And he stuck, very much like Trump, he stuck with that to his grave.
The other fascinating thing about a man that nobody knows is that Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, very heavy-duty economist in Washington, loves Henry George.
Well, I think Joe is very much from the tradition of sort of American radicalism, anti-monopolies. I mean, he's very American sort of radical. He wasn't an anti-capitalist. He actually says the capitalist is useful as long as he's not a monopolist. He believed in free enterprise, and he thought that the landlords and the big railroads were a big enemy of his. As I say, he grew up in Philly, but he moved to California originally as part of the lifeguard service, but he jumped off his ship and joined a gold rush. That didn't work. I guess he got there too late or something. So he washed back down the coast to San Francisco and became a newspaper man, writing newspaper editorials for the sort of radical Republican paper at the time, the party of Lincoln at the time. And the whole tradition of sort of American radicalism, the self-made man was obviously a reality in pre-industrial America. Marx and Engels used to lament the United States, because it didn't fit the European class model. And Marx blamed that on the frontier. He said, you can't have really class consciousness or class conflict when the workers can just push off to the West and set up as farmers.
Several points here. Self-made man, the radical single tax, which sounds a lot like Donald Trump's utter reliance on magical tariffs to balance everything. There are Trumpian hints here. Could a single tax on just land have done what he thought it would?
Well, it was certainly a lot more practical in the late 19th century than it is now because the government was tiny relative to today. The whole US government was about 3% of GDP. We don't have GDP, so all these figures are estimates. But economic historians have gone back and they've figured out that most of the duties did come from customs and tariffs, etc., most of the revenues. And they supported a government, a federal army, etc., of about 3%. Obviously, during the Civil War, they'd built up huge debts. But if you have a government that's 3% of GDP, you can figure maybe a single tax on land might have been enough to... there are some Georgians, he's still got people who support him, who suggest that maybe it would have worked. Or even if it wouldn't have worked, it certainly would have been a large revenue stream relative to the size of the government. Today, where you have governments of sort of a third of GDP or bigger. I think federal, state and local in the United States is, 40% getting close to of GDP. And in Europe and most other advanced countries, it's 50% of GDP. It's absolutely, fantastical fake news to think that you could finance that.
So why does Joseph Stiglitz admire him?
He doesn't advocate a land tax as the solution to our ills, but Joe is in favor of a wealth tax of sorts, of somehow taxing wealth. Now, back in the late 19th century, what was wealth? In the United States, the biggest source of wealth was the land. Without being too specific and saying we have to tax the land and that's the key to everything, the general principle that large agglomerations of wealth should be taxed is a sort of Georgian notion. And I think that's something which Joe would sympathize with. And I think he'd also sympathize with the idea that you need some restraints on capitalism. You need some restraints on big business because there is a sort of innate tendency in a lot of the economy towards monopolies and big businesses. That's not free enterprise.
There's a nice personal, human, maybe moral touch about Henry George in that, what did he know? He knew what he saw, which was in this incredible boom, this poverty.
Right.
And we got to do something about it.
Right. Another reason why Henry George is extremely contemporary in one way is that, having made all these arguments, his sort of summary was that sort of unrestrained capitalism, or landlordism as he would have seen it, is not consistent with democracy, or what he saw as republicanism.
Right.
At the end of Progress and Poverty, he has a chapter where he sort of summarizes everything, and that's his sort of parting message, and he brings it back to ancient Rome. He said, if you look at the great countries and empires of the past, what is it that's brought them down in the end? And he says it's soaring inequality, huge gaps between rich and poor. And he says, basically, that level of inequality is not consistent with democracy. And, what have we had in the last 30 years? We've had this incredible increase in inequality, unprecedented, really, since the 1980s. Huge agglomerations of wealth created. And what have we ended up with? At the end of the heel of the hunt, we've ended up with a crisis of democracy.
Yeah. Add these to the costs of capitalism as we've managed it. John Cassidy, I want you to come back to the moment you were speaking of when neoliberalism was born, and what was it born of? Can I tell you a quick story? I think it was born in the presidency of Jimmy Carter, but before that, in the Jimmy Carter campaign, there was a moment in the Pennsylvania primary when he was pitching mine workers in the western part of the state. They wanted black lung benefits, and he didn't want to give them to them. And in the end, he said to their leaders, they chose to be miners, which is to say, there's something deep in it, which is to say, your livelihood is your problem, and it's not the government's. Hubert Humphrey was in the wings, maybe going to run if Carter stumbled, also Ted Kennedy, out of that pre-neoliberal tradition. But Jimmy Carter was a deregulator in the end, a hands-off sort of guy, and the Atari Democrats came later, Paul Tsongas, Bill Clinton to some degree. But that was the moment of change. Does that fit your sense
definitely.
of things?
I mean, I think you have to place it in context, because deregulation originally was a democratic invention. People forget that. I mean, the original deregulator, Alfred Kahn, who deregulated the airlines, was a free market Democrat, sort of advised Ted Kennedy, I think. So there was a crisis of the sort of Keynesian model in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. It was widely seen to have failed because of the rise of inflation and unemployment at the same time, stagflation, another term which is coming back into vogue, illustrating my theme that things always recur in capitalism over the long term. So the stagflation crisis of the early 70s, in Keynesian economics, as it was conceived then, there's now new Keynesianisms, all sorts of different Keynesianisms, but the sort of mainstream Keynesianism of the 1960s had great difficulty explaining how you could get rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time, because it was based on, the simplistic version anyway, was based on the curve known as the Phillips curve, in which inflation and unemployment go in opposite directions. So the sight of them both going up together in the early 70s after the oil price shock, and after the huge increase in government spending to finance the Civil War and the Great Society, that was seen at the time as a sort of indictment of the Keynesian social democratic model. And that is what gave the sort of neoliberals, who had been there all the time in sort of University of Chicago and other places. Milton Friedman. Friedman is a sort of, a deep thinker in some ways, but he also is a very shrewd politician. And Friedman basically said the role of the economist is, and the free market economist, is to keep ideas alive, certain ideas alive, until the sort of history comes around and we have a chance to put them into effect. He realized that nobody was going to buy his ideas in the 1950s and early 1960s, but then when the Keynesian crisis came, the neoliberals came. And there was also a feeling, just getting onto the deregulation and we move on to Carter, that regulation had gone too far. The airlines is the classic example, because there were a handful of big carriers. You basically had to go and ask Washington if you wanted to fly between a city which didn't have a route. was very strictly controlled.
Yes.
You couldn't just, say, I'll buy a plane and fly from sort of Peoria to Chicago or whatever. The major carriers had it wrapped up, and they charged high prices. Some liberal-minded, like small L, liberal-minded sort of Harvard economists like Alfred Kahn, they would say that this was sort of monopoly capitalism supported by the government, allowing the major carriers to dominate the market. So it was under Carter that Congress originally passed airline deregulation, and then it moved from airline deregulation into other sectors of the economy where it was a lot less benign, especially finance. That's how I read it. It's not accurate to say it was completely a Republican invention. It was there was a bipartisan consensus at the time that, we needed some deregulation.
Speak about the economy and capitalism in our heads. It seems to me the neoliberal notion still is with us, that the economy is on its own and we can't regulate it. I was thinking, for example, Jeff Bezos's declaration for the Washington Post that opinion pieces anywhere near the editorial page will all henceforth rest on pillars of support for personal liberties and free markets. Came out of the blue in a sense, but it said a lot. How do you read it?
I read that as basically Jeff Bezos saying that he was, again, paying homage to Trump. Trump would say he believes in the free market, but Jeff Bezos saying he believes in the free market is a bit of a joke, right? I mean, Amazon's a huge monopolistic company. The idea that he believes in sort of free competition, you'd have to go and talk to all the retailers he's put out of business. They would give you a clearer read on that than I can.
It's another question, but I got to put it out. Why does so much of the economics coverage and commentary rest on statements that make no sense?
Because there's two economics. There is something of a science underneath it. If you want to discover, how best monetary policy works or fiscal policy works or how price controls will work in a particular market, there are economic models which will help you figure that out, simple sort of textbook models, which are useful and helpful. So economics is a real subject. But at the same time, it's also an ideological battle and always has been. So all sides of the political spectrum, and I would say particularly the right, try to cast sort of their self-interested arguments in the language, in their case, in the language of free market economics. So you never get anybody standing up in Washington and saying what we need in this. Actually, Calvin Coolidge did it, but that's a long time ago. What we need is more big business. Let's make big business bigger. That's what's most efficient. They don't say that. They say what we need is free markets, keep the government out of everything, and things will work well. But as I said, it's when the Biden administration tried to actually put that into action by having some proper antitrust policies, the tech barons especially cried foul. That's a huge reason why they're backing Trump, because they got annoyed at the Biden administration, Lena Khan and her colleagues trying to resurrect antitrust as another movement which goes back a long way in American history to the sort of days of just after Henry George of the 1890s. So, as I said, economics is a tricky subject because it is a real subject, but at the same time there's a lot of BS because it's also a political ideological battle.
I learned something in the introduction to your book, John. You said it was the Bernie Sanders campaign in the winter of 2016 that inspired you to write the book. And it was basically the discovery that young Americans and older Americans too don't much like capitalism. And there were votes to be won on a very irreverent challenge to the whole game.
Polling depends how you define it, but the idea for this book sort of came to me during the 2016 campaign, because it was pretty clear at that stage that whatever the economic model was, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, hyperglobalization, hypercapitalism, whatever we call it, it was in crisis. It was being attacked from both sides. There was a crisis of legitimacy, basically. From the left, you had Bernie running his insurgent campaign.
Elizabeth Warren, too.
And Elizabeth Warren, I think she probably thinks she should have run, but didn't run then, but was attacking Wall Street. And
the game is rigged. You
exactly.
can't win.
And Trump came in and made exactly the same argument from the right. And one of the things people forget about Trump is that in 2016, he ran a very insurgent campaign. He ran against Wall Street. He said the bankers were crooks and promised to do something about it. People have forgotten that now, but it was very much a sort of attacking the economic establishment from the right. Of course, he didn't do anything about it, and he never had any intention to do anything about it. He worships Wall Street. But he saw it was a popular stance to take, and he took it. And I saw some particular opinion polls ran at the time, both in Britain and in the US. The ones in the US were more striking to me, where they just asked people sort of open-ended questions. Do you have positive feelings about various isms? And two of the isms were socialism and capitalism. And in this polling in the US, socialism did better than capitalism among people, I think, under 35. And the numbers for capitalism, were very low. And a similar poll was run by a free market institute in the UK and came up with similar results. And the man who ran it said he basically commissioned the poll to try and get support for sort of entrepreneurship and free markets. And turned out that they were very unpopular at the time. There was a crisis, as what I call a crisis of legitimacy, which goes back several directions. Partly it was a crisis of sort of decades of wage stagnation associated with union busting, globalization, sort of aggressive management, technical progress, automation. And then capitalism basically blows up, or global financial system almost blows up in 2008, 2009, and it's widely perceived that the villains of the piece get away with everything. There are no charges brought against the bankers, or very few of them. That was one of the things which turned public opinion against the Obama administration, I think, even though the crisis and the blow-up came on George W. Bush's tenure, and the Republicans were largely responsible for supporting a lot of the stuff that went on. But the Treasury Secretary at the time, Tim Geithner himself, who basically enacted a lot of these policies, he made the argument, actually in an interview with me, the only way you can prop up capitalism, financial system, when it gets in this sort of state is to do some very unpopular things like bailing out bankers. And that's what they did.
The evils of capitalism are still out there and quite well remembered. Exploitation of the working poor. I mean, the sweatshops
right
in Asia especially are horrific. The tilt to monopoly, the connection historically with imperialism, colonial capitalism, and the instability of it. There's your crisis of legitimacy. But what is to do about it? Why are there so few takers who will pledge to be responsible for the economy?
Why is capitalism so durable, even though it's plagued by these long-term and short-term crises? And I think there's two answers to that. Number one, for all its ills, it has been associated with massive economic growth over the last 2.5 centuries. There's a hockey stick chart for global GDP, which basically tracks the emissions chart. And it's basically flat from, antiquity to 1800, and then it takes off gradually, and then it goes up in a straight line. Capitalism has delivered the bacon in that sense, in an aggregate sense. And in recent decades, globalization was bad for the Western economy or, middle-class workers in places like the Midwest, but it's been very good for a lot of Chinese and Indians who've been dragged out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of people in China and India dragged out of poverty. Now, they're not rich, but they're less poor than they used to be. How did they do that? They came by integrating their economies into the global capitalist model. Initially, in a lot of places, through sweatshops, etc. The Chinese have rapidly moved up the value chain and are now obviously ahead of the United States and ahead of Europe and the United States in a lot of areas, including sort of electric vehicles. So I'm a critic of capitalism, but you have to recognize the productivity of the system over the centuries.
The invention.
Yeah, Marx himself recognized that. If you read the Communist Manifesto, in part, it reads like a sort of manifesto for global capitalism. And he says capitalists have created miracles which outdid the ancient pyramids. And, they go all over the world. And it's obviously very destructive. His famous quote about everything being destroyed and everything becomes profane. But he recognized the productive side of it. And the challenge has always been for the left, or the center, or even the left, how do you produce a alternative model which maintains the sort of innovation and productivity of capitalism while getting rid of its really offensive features?
Let's count also the incredible environmental damage, which also means displacement, a worldwide immigration crisis, which becomes a political crisis. I mean, there's some big problems out there. What's so striking is that nobody is owning up.
Well, I think there is a huge movement. The political system, especially in the US, is basically owned by the money, right? America has got a bought political system, especially, since Citizens United.
Yep.
So there are two questions. Is there a big mass movement out there of people who are pissed off about the various ills of capitalism? I think the answer is yes. I mean, Trump in his own way taps into that. The people who thought they were being left out, the coasts were benefiting from globalization and they were being left to fester. That's a critique of capitalism. That's not how Trump presents it. But to the people concerned, the system wasn't working for them. So, that is a critique. There are all sorts of other critiques. I mean, I'm on the left, so we've had sort of critiques forever. But the point you make about environmentalism is a crucial one because, as I said, the defense of capitalism has always been that it delivers the bacon. And state socialism for decades also delivered the bacon for the Russians and dragged them out of poverty and was actually pretty successful for 4 or 5 decades just in transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. But ultimately it couldn't compete with the sort of Western private enterprise-based capitalism. So that has produced a crisis on the left for the last sort of 20 or 30 years. What's our alternative? But I think now there's another critique, especially among people under the age of, say, 40 or so. I think they primarily view capitalism through, a lot of them anyway, through an environmental lens and through the lens of global warming and emissions and all the problems which you mentioned, mass migration, the environmental damage, terrible damage to the oceans and everything. You talk to a lot of young people, their critique of capitalism is so much where I'm coming from in terms of instability, inequality, exploitation of workers, although obviously some of them recognize those things. As Greta Thunberg famously said in 2019, they said, how can you even think about this and your stories of eternal growth when the world is burning? So that, I think, is a huge contemporary critique of capitalism, which we haven't really come to terms with at all yet. We've had some limited efforts through the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accords, but I don't think anybody thinks that's enough. That's really a new critique, and I do trace it back to the sort of limits of growth debate we had in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And the people who warned about it then were basically sort of, widely dismissed by economists and governments, etc. So in a sense, the crisis now is the crisis of climate change, is a sort of 50-year on payback from the sort of limits to growth debate.
John, who is critiquing the gold rush now toward AI and taking responsibility for the incredible range of implications that has for all of us?
It's a tough one. I mean, you say who's taking responsibility for it? Nobody really. I mean, the Biden administration did put out a sort of general statement of principles. There were very well-meaning principles, but there were certainly no specific policies. And Trump is in hock with Silicon Valley and the tech billionaires, so there's absolutely no chance, I don't think, of any legislation or sort of directives coming from that. We basically handed it over to the profit motive, and you saw that in the history of OpenAI itself when it converted to a public company. Now there's talk of it converting back to a not-for-profit, although I'm sure the OpenAI subsidiary will still be a profit-making.
It just seems inadequate, doesn't it? I mean,
concern.
I'm thinking of a conversation with Ray Kurzweil more than 20 years ago.
Right.
We all agreed that we are the horses about to be undone by this revolution.
Right.
I mean, horses were crucial to every aspect of life until the 1940s, really.
Right.
And, of course, we've discovered other ways to plow a field with
Right.
tractors and whatnot. But
I think you're right. I mean, Ray Kurzweil, Jeff Hinton, some of the sort of giants of deep learning and AI have been warning about this. It's not just journalists or commentators. The only defense I can make of the sort of status quo is it all has happened incredibly quickly in terms of the sort of commercialization and spread of it. I mean, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it took 40 or 50 years really for steam technology to sort of become the norm in the industrial economy. It looks like AI is going to become the norm in a decade or so anyway, maybe 2 decades. It is all happening incredibly quickly, and we have a dysfunctional political system anyway. So I think it's just too much for the political system to handle at the moment.
you write at the end that capitalism has this unbelievable power to adapt, to reinvent itself, to rename itself. What if the problem is even worse, more terminal than that, in this division of incredible wealth and vast poverty?
If you go back to Marx and Engels and the socialists before them, the original sort of critics of capitalism, they thought capitalism was on a one-way trajectory. It would grow and then it would decline and collapse.
And a revolution would
Right,
kill it.
there'd be a revolution and then there'd be something else. That's a sort of unicycle. They would have one cycle and that would be it. What's actually happened in history is you've had a series of cycles, long cycles, short cycles, And capitalism has somehow managed to survive, largely in my telling, because the government gets involved in various ways. The government gets involved in a Keynesian way, in sort of propping up demand, which gets you through crises, but much more than that. It also, in the sort of liberal social democratic way, the government provides a social safety net, which puts a floor, at least in principle, under how low people can go, so that they don't turn into sans-culottes, in the old sort of French term. If the government hadn't grown up, I think capitalism would have collapsed and been overthrown in a revolution. But the government acts as a support system at the same time as restraining it, which is always why I've never really understood this sort of stark, to me, completely unrealistic, dichotomous model where you have the free market on one side and you have the government on another. You know, going back more than 100 years now, they've been totally intertwined, mutually supportive, symbiotic systems. And that's the only way. There are very few old school socialist central planners left who want to sort of resurrect the Soviet Union model. It's an interesting debate whether computers and everything make that more practical, but whatever. There are very few people who support that now. So if you take that off the table, the question is, how do you manage capitalism? Where on the spectrum of sort of government versus the market do we pitch our tents? And the sort of left extreme now, I think you have the degrowth people who would say the government needs to take a very interventionist role and basically we're not going to pursue endless growth anymore. GDP is a meaningless measure. Sustainability, environmentalism, they should be the touchstones. That's how we should judge things. Then slightly to the right of them, but a long way to the left of the mainstream in the US, are the sort of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC Democrats, who I guess I would associate with. They're looking for some sort of new social democratic bargain. Trump dismisses them as Marxists. It's just absolute nonsense. I've never seen Bernie Sanders recommending mass public ownership, which is what socialism used to be. When I was in the Labour Party 40 years ago in Britain, I used to carry the party card and had Clause 4 on it, famous Clause 4, which was a commitment to nationalise the public ownership of the means of production. That is socialism. What we're talking about now is social democracy and how far to go with social democracy, a mixed economy. I'm sort of in that tradition, and the book raises the question, can we produce a social bargain for the 21st century like we did in the middle of the 20th century?
John, that's exactly where my head was going. And I wanted you to take us back to that moment. I think it was 1948, and a bargain was struck that began that 30-year golden age. And there was a specific incident, it's in your book, with a contract to be signed between, I think it was General Motors and the United Auto Workers. And very consciously, I think, they said, this is a bargain for a new era, post-war. And by gum, it worked. And you and I both grew up in it.
Right. I was a direct beneficiary of it. I grew up in the English welfare state and was a scholarship boy, and went to university.
Tony Judt wrote very beautifully about it, and I bet you knew him.
Yeah.
But public transportation, public education, public health.
Right.
What was the rest?
Public retirement plans as well, of course.
Exactly. Okay. Imagine the terms and the issues that would have to be in a new bargain for a new capitalism or something for us and eventually for the world.
You need a strong social safety net. Healthcare, most people would agree, is turned into a financial disaster and is sort of swallowing up more and more of the economy. So we need some way to provide public health care to everybody at less than astronomical cost, which it will be if we leave it entirely to the private sector. So some sort of public-private partnership there. I doubt the US is ever going to go fully in the direction of a sort of British National Health Service, but some sort of deal there. Education, again, is a huge issue because it's just getting so expensive. They were part of the traditional social democratic model, and they need to be part of the model going forward, but they need to be somehow modernized.
When you say modernized, you don't mean just limited healthcare or limited
No,
education.
I mean public healthcare. But I think everybody has a right to healthcare. But how do you deliver it at a cost which the tax base will support? Now, part of it is expanding the tax base by taxing parts of the income and wealth which currently escape the tax system. So part of it is the sort of, expanding the sort of Warren and to some extent Biden at the end of his administration agenda of expanding the tax base, both on corporations, wealthy people, etc. That seems to me to be an inevitable part of whatever this social bargain is. They're all manageable. The issue is getting domestic support for them. The trickier issue sort of conceptually is how you do it on a global basis, because we're now in this global economy. And so many of these issues, such as tax evasion, climate change and its devastating impact, that is the classic example. It has to be tackled on a global level. Even if a miracle happened and the US decided to adopt a real Green New Deal overnight, that wouldn't solve the world's problem. So that has to be part of it. And I don't have a solution to that. There was an international aspect to the original Keynesian bargain, which was basically fixed currencies and controlling capital movements and open trade as far as was possible. Once you've done that, the policies were all national based. It's obviously much trickier when you have to do it on a global basis.
You imagine AOC, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders as the political captains. Can you get to that sort of politics from where we are with Donald Trump?
To be pessimistic, the last existential crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, Karl Polanyi,
yes,
the Austrian social theorist, he came to the conclusion in the Great Depression that capitalism and democracy basically are incompatible over the long term. And the only logical outcome of the system was either fascism on the one hand or socialism on the other. He just didn't think the centre ground could hold. Keynesianism then came along and proved that wrong for 3 or 4 decades. But what we've seen in the last few decades is the centre ground breaking again. So if you want to be pessimistic, you could say, well, we're moving towards a sort of fascistic model or a right-wing populist model anyway, which rejects the sort of globalization completely. Now, what's the alternative to that? What's the socialist model or what's the social democratic model? I think that's the big question. Is there a new paradigm out there somewhere which, we can sort of draw upon? I'm not completely pessimistic, as I say. I think there are elements of it. There are elements at the domestic level, sort of wage boards to prop up wages. You need to strengthen. The labour movement does need to be stronger than it is now. I don't think it's ever going to be as strong as it was in the early to mid-20th century. We do have certain elements of the model which we know have to be part of it, but I think it is fair to say that nobody's really put it all together yet in a way in which you can sell in an election.
John Cassidy, thank you so much for Capitalism and Its Critics, from the Industrial Revolution to AI. Wonderful reading, and it's wonderful to gab with you about it.
Oh, thanks very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Season to season, John Cassidy writes on economics for the New Yorker magazine. In terms of economics, think of open source as a non-commercial enterprise that counts on the support of listeners who like it. If you haven't done your part yet, please go now to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We are proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you.